Good evening. I'm Arian Mack, the organizer of this event and a professor of psychology at the New School for Social Research and director of the Center for Public Scholarship, which is doing this event. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today to the New School and to the 7th event in our Public Voices series. The series, which we began in 2012, is meant to address the, read with them or without them. The series, which we began in 2012, is meant to provide a platform for distinguished public figures and scholars to address the most pressing issues of the day. We have been fortunate enough to have had, since we began, such speakers as Russ Feingold, Steven Pinker, Robert J. Lifton, Nicholas Eberstadt, William Galston, Barney Frank, James Banford, and Naomi Oreskes, and they've addressed topics as wide-ranging as climate change and military spending and violence. Tonight, we revisit a topic particularly close to us and one we've discussed before. Namely the transforming, often in what appears to be alarming ways, of the character of higher education and what that portends for scholarly knowledge and for our society. In December 2011, we convened a major conference on the subject of the challenges facing higher education, titled "The Future of Higher Education," which Ken played a role. The conference, the papers from that conference became a special issue of Social Research, which is on sale over there, and you're welcome to get it. It covers a lot of ground, and some of which is going to be recovered tonight, I suspect. Anyway, we also then, following that, we convened a discussion, just a panel discussion of university presidents who addressed issues facing higher education, and that group talked about the problem of the rising costs facing both the student population and universities themselves, particularly those that live on tuition, like the New School. And then the last conversation in this series on higher education was in 2013, when we organized a discussion of the horrendous crisis of higher education in Syria as a result of the civil war, which of course continues. You probably know that all of our panelists today are deeply engaged with the issues confronting universities. Andrew Delbanco, Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University, addressed the rising cost of higher education and the inequalities rising from it, visible in the student body of universities, in a recent piece in the New York Review of Books that was published this past summer. Marina Warner, Professor of English and Creative Writing at Birkbeck, University of London, wrote in a March issue of the London Review of Books about her alarming experience at Essex University in the UK, where she had been teaching, and brings a more global perspective to this evening's discussion. Richard Kahlenberg, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, has written widely about issues of inequality and educational access. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist, David Bromwich, is not able to join us today. He has a very serious problem in his family. His mother is desperately ill. We are, however, very fortunate to, at the last minute, been able to replace him with Jim Miller, my colleague here at the New School, who has published widely, and his most recent book, published in 2012, is, I have the wrong thing here. Jim, help me.
Examined lives.
Excuse me?
Examined lives.
Yeah, from Socrates to Nietzsche. And we're very grateful to all of our speakers, panelists tonight for being willing to be part of this discussion. And I'm particularly grateful to my friend Ken Pruitt, who will moderate this panel. Ken is the Carnegie Professor of Public Affairs at Columbia University and the Director of the Scholarly Knowledge Project. He has had many lives, which have included being Director of the U.S. Census Bureau, twice Head of Social Science Research Council, the Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. And this is just a smattering.
And he can't hold a job.
He has authored and co-authored an amazingly large number of books and articles. His most recent book, published by Princeton in 2013, is titled, "What is Your Race? The Census and Other Flawed Efforts to Classify Americans." It's now my pleasure to give this to Ken.
Thank you, Arian. We're going to start. I think it would help the panelists to get a slight sense of the audience. You don't have to be a student at the New School, but anyone who is currently a student in an institution of higher education, would you hold your hands up? No, leave your hand up. Now, if you're not in debt, lower your hand. Thank you. What? You want to do it twice? Lots of debt. All right, good. How many have lots of debt? Yeah. And how many are faculty either here or elsewhere? And lower your hand if you're a full-time regular faculty as against an adjunct and so forth and so on. So more than half of you are in a more complicated status with respect to faculty. And that's something we will want to address, as well as student debt and all the other issues that go into this. A word or two about introduction. The panelists are going to each speak, give or take 5 minutes, longer if they must or want to, either way. But they're going to introduce themselves intellectually rather than biographically. You've got materials on who we are, and you heard some of it from Arian. All of these panelists are here because they've written books, written essays, have awards, have major positions, have ministered in higher education, and so forth and so on. They wouldn't be here otherwise, and so to go through all of that won't teach you anything you don't already know, just by virtue of the fact that we're sitting up here at this panel. But what I'm asking them to do to get us started is take a problem from their perspective about the landscape of higher education. We'll primarily probably stick to the United States, though we don't have to, and then in one important case, we'll go to Great Britain. But people can talk about higher education systems elsewhere. But this is largely Anglo-American conversation. If later we want to get into some of the things that are happening in other parts of the world, which are fascinating in higher education, Saudi Arabia and China and India and so forth and so on, we might do that. But for now, we'll stick. It's big enough to take on the issues that face Anglo-American institutions of higher education. And we will pretty well stick with the at a certain, we won't get into the non-for-profit world very much. Some of you will have seen the lead article in today's New York Times about the enormous debt associated with students who are in those rip-off organizations. And that's a serious crisis of its own sort, but we'll probably not be able to get very deeply into that topic. And we'll stick largely with independent colleges and universities as we're all familiar with them. To keep you off your toes, or no, off your toes. What's that?
On your toes.
I know. What would it be? No, I'm trying to figure out suddenly what would it be to be off your toes? Just on your feet, I guess. I don't know. We're going to skip around a bit on the panel. We won't go right down the row. Andy will speak first, and then we'll go down to Rick, and then we'll come back to Marina, and then we'll go to Jim. If you can figure out the rationale for that, you're welcome. But it's simple. Jim, as Arian said, came late to this. He just heard this afternoon that he was going to join this panel. So I think he has the right to sort of, take notes from everybody else and use that as his leaping off point if he wants to. So, Andy.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Arian. Thank you, Ken. What Ken didn't quite say is that we sort of arranged this. We imagined a kind of lugubrious laundry list of all the horrors associated with higher education, and we got to choose our favorite item off the list with which to start. So I said, okay, I'll talk a little bit about the faculty, what it means to be in a faculty now as opposed to in the past, and perhaps what it'll be in the future. And I'm very conscious in speaking about this topic very briefly that I've had the great good fortune of entering a university faculty at a moment which was more or less a golden age when one could, if one got lucky, live the ideal of having a manageable teaching load, so one could put one's energy into one's teaching but not be completely emotionally and intellectually exhausted by it, and have some reserves left over for pursuing one's intellectual interests. I think we've discovered there are a lot of faculty in the room, that everyone would probably agree that that age, at least when that was a norm or a reasonable expectation for young faculty or graduate students hoping to become faculty, that era is behind us. I don't have the precise numbers, but I think it's fairly close to accurate to say that when I was starting out almost 40 years ago now, about 65% of American college and university professors were either tenured or on a tenure track appointment. That makes 35% who were not. And today it's approximately the other way around, or even worse than that. Worse if you believe that tenure or some form of job security is a good thing. One observation to make, which I think is probably obvious to most of us, is that when faculty describe this situation and feel bad about it, as I think they have every right to do, they're describing a situation which is more broadly evident in our society. That is the casualization of labor, the decline of the predictable career path for young people is hardly a phenomenon restricted to the academic world. So in that way, I suppose we've become less of an ivory tower than we once were, less removed from the world than we once were. I know people who are making a living by working as contingent or adjunct faculty who are among the most intellectually powerful and dedicated teachers I know. It is, however, the case that there are pretty good data to suggest that this phenomenon has had a negative effect on the morale of such people, and it has a negative effect on student learning. Not because part-time faculty or contingent faculty aren't good teachers, but because by the nature of the reality of their lives, they're not likely to have the time to devote to their individual students that they would have if they made a life on a single campus and didn't have to worry about whether they were working next year. Another phenomenon of which to take note is that over the last quarter century or so, growth in administration has greatly outpaced growth in faculty. That observation is often made as a sort of prelude to attacking the venality and evil-mindedness of college and university administrators, which is not my intention. I think there are actually many very dedicated people in administrative posts in colleges and universities, and many reasons for this growth in administration that are defensible and indeed insuperable in certain ways. There is an increasing regulatory burden imposed on institutions of higher learning by government, which requires lots of people to deal with on campus. Students are increasingly stressed and need additional mental health and counseling and career services in a way that earlier generations may not have needed, so that there are good, benign, and defensible reasons for this growth of the size of the administration. And I don't mean to demonize administrators by making the point, though some of my senior administrative colleagues uptown would count me among the demonizers. But it's a fact of life, and of course it means that resources are shifting from the building of the faculty to the building of the bureaucracy in many institutions. Another phenomenon that is associated with the ones I've already mentioned is I think there's a palpable disconnection of most, or at least let's say many to be safe, faculty from participation in university governance. Now, the term university governance sometimes conveys the impression that when faculty speak about that, they mean that faculty should run the university. They should govern the university, which in fact I think has almost never been the case, and probably wouldn't be a great idea if it were the case. What it means to me is that faculty should have a real role, a real opportunity to participate in setting the priorities of the institution. Their voice should be heard, just as the voice of students should be heard in the governance of the university. And I think it's quite clear that that faculty governance is on the decline, again, for many different reasons. In the elite institutions, it's a sort of voluntary decline. Faculty have stepped away from engagement in the institution, and it's often startling to me, actually, how little very intelligent faculty, very well equipped to understand such things, actually know about the institutions in which they work, but their affiliations are more likely with their professional colleagues and professional associations. They're traveling all the time. They're on talk shows and writing books and so on, and so the last thing that they're interested in is what's going on at the home institution. At the lower end of the prestige scale in American higher education, and I hasten to say just quickly that though there's a pretty clear prestige scale, I don't think there's any reason to believe that it correlates with a quality scale in many cases. But at the lower end of the prestige scale, in community colleges, for example, faculty just don't have the time and the clout to participate in university governance. As a teacher of mine once said to me when I got my tenure, he said, the main reason for tenure is to allow for faculty governance. Faculty without tenure cannot safely participate in the governance of the institution. And so as we have fewer and fewer tenured faculty, we have less and less faculty governance. Very quickly, just a couple other things to remark on. I don't know to what extent we'll be speaking about this tonight, but we're all aware of what is sometimes called the digital revolution that is either front and center in higher education or lurking around the edges of institutions of higher education. A few years ago, people were rather apocalyptic about it and said that the so-called brick university was about to disappear and the click university would take its place. That hasn't happened, although there are some signs that many institutions are under increasing stress and that the digital delivery of education, if that's a reasonable way to describe it, is not going to go away, and it's going to grow, and it's going to become more effective, and it's going to be a more and more important part in the lives of everybody in academia, from students all the way up. And one of the, I think, likely implications of this revolution is that many faculty are going to feel more and more as if they are, in effect, glorified teaching assistants. That is, some superstar professor will be piped in some form or other with a MOOC or some other delivery system to give the dazzling lectures or to be the voice in the blended learning environment, and that local faculty will become sort of subsidiary coaches for the students under the watchful eye of the big brother out there. Finally, I mean, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think it's something that's not unreasonable to worry about. Finally, I guess just broadly speaking, I think a lot of faculty feel, for a combination of reasons that I've mentioned, and I'm sure many others that I haven't, that the autonomy of the college teacher, which is perhaps a reason that many of us went into this field, the excitement of being able to shape the intellectual experience inside the classroom, not impose it on one's students, but to create a certain kind of atmosphere, to decide what the important questions are, to kind of put the stamp of one's personality on the subject that one is teaching, that's becoming harder and harder to achieve. And that faculty are more and more, and this is certainly happening in the for-profit institutions that Ken mentioned in passing, that faculty are being handed a template. Here, this is what we want you to teach, this is how we want you to teach it, and if you don't want to do it, we'll go find somebody else who will, because there are plenty out there willing to take a shot at it. So on that cheerful note, I will stop and pass it on to, I guess,
Thanks,
Rick is
Rick.
next.
Yep.
Great, thank you, Andy, and it's wonderful to be here. Many of you may not know what the Century Foundation is. It's a progressive think tank with offices in New York and Washington. It was founded in 1919 by Edward Filene, whose basement some of you may have visited. We are an institution that cares a lot about inequality in society, and that's the inequality and growing stratification within higher education is what I would put at the top of my list of worries or complaints. So the good news is that more people are going to college than ever before. 86% of high school graduates go on to some college, which is a great accomplishment. The bad news is that as more people go to college, we've seen increasing stratification. A more pointed term would be segregation between institutions by race and by socioeconomic status. So if you look at the most selective 193 institutions, rich kids outnumber poor kids by 14 to 1. So you're 14 times as likely to run into a student who's from the top socioeconomic quarter of the population as opposed to the bottom socioeconomic quarter. By contrast, at community colleges, wealthy students are outnumbered by poor students by about 2 to 1. We also see similar trends along racial and ethnic lines, with African American and Latino students increasingly concentrated at two-year colleges, and white and Asian students at more selective colleges. If you throw in the for-profits, the situation becomes even more dramatic, where a lot of particularly African American students are going to for-profit institutions. When I'm at the health club, sometimes I watch these various ads on TV, and you don't often see a lot of African Americans, in the commercials. But then, DeVry University comes on, and suddenly there's an array of African Americans. These for-profit institutions, which have a really dismal record for the most part of graduating students, are targeting some of our more vulnerable populations. So that's the first point I want to make. Second point is, why should we care about this stratification? Well, the opportunities are dramatically different depending on what type of institution an individual goes to. And we should care about the fact that low-income and minority students are much less likely to be at selective colleges because that is, that is the future of our country. Not to put too fine a point on it, but those of us up here do not represent what is going to become the majority of the student population. And so, if there are unequal opportunities, that's something to be really concerned about. Four-year institutions, particularly selective institutions, spend many more dollars per student than low-income, than community colleges do. And you see dramatically different results. So at the selective four-year colleges, about 86% of students graduate. At community colleges, on the other hand, 81% of students coming in for the first time say they would like to get a four-year degree. That is, they want to get their associate's degree and then transfer to get a four-year bachelor's degree. After 6 years, 12% are successful. Now, clearly that's on one level a very unfair comparison because the preparation levels are very different for students at selective four-year colleges versus community colleges. But even when you control for those factors and compare equally prepared students, so the same race, same ethnicity, same everything, there is a community college penalty. That is, your chances of getting a four-year degree ultimately are much, much lower for equally prepared students if they start at a two-year institution than a four-year institution. In addition, if you look at where our nation's leadership comes from, it's skewed heavily towards selective colleges. Just one data point on this. Roughly half of the top government leaders and half of the top corporate leaders in this country come from just 12 institutions. These institutions represent less than 1% of the student body population, but they have half the slots. So it matters who goes where. Third observation, why is stratification occurring? It seems to me the incentive structure is pointing universities in this direction. So politicians compete for votes and corporations compete for who has the largest profits. Higher education institutions, for the most part, compete on prestige. And nothing is more important than U.S. News and World Report and their rankings. Now, every college president will say they don't look at that, and every one of the trustees is on their backs. Why did we drop 2 points this year? So the problem is that U.S. News is going to reward institutions not for providing access to low-income students. In fact, quite the opposite. Cappy Hill, who's the president of Vassar College and is an economist, said that all the incentives align against an institution admitting low-income students because that's expensive to do. You have to help pay their tuition. And in essence, every dollar you spend on financial aid for low-income students is a quote-unquote diversion from investments that could increase your rankings. So if you put the money into merit aid, or if you hire Nobel Prize-winning faculty with lucrative incentives, that will increase your rankings, but providing access to low-income students will not. So that's a major problem. As a result, we see what counts in admissions. Admissions officers will say, well, it's a holistic admissions process, and we don't, we look at a lot of different factors. But when you run the regressions, it turns out that the things that matter in admissions are, number one, being a recruited athlete. That's worth a lot. Number two, being an underrepresented minority. That matters because having a lack of racial and ethnic diversity is very visible and embarrassing to an institution, as it ought to be. Third is legacy preferences for the children of alumni. And then if you look at whether you get a bump up for being low income, that is, you've done pretty well despite the obstacles, despite being low income, and there's no bump up whatsoever, no preference provided to low income students. Last thing I'll say goes to the question of whether there's any hope for this to change. And ironically, I think there are two kind of center-right or more conservative developments that will shake up the system and help provide more opportunities for economically disadvantaged students. The first is that the Supreme Court is likely to significantly curtail race-based preferences in admissions. There's an oral argument in December on a case involving the University of Texas at Austin and the use of race in admissions. And the good news is that we've seen what's happened in states where race-based affirmative action has been banned by voter initiative. And universities don't give up on racial diversity. They instead try to find other ways to get it. And they do it by providing a leg up to economically disadvantaged students of all races and substantially increasing financial aid for these students. And so that's a way to get racial diversity indirectly, but also benefit a lot of economically disadvantaged students. And the other development that I'm somewhat nervous about, but I think could have a positive effect for low-income students, is the movement towards state funding of institutions based on outcomes rather than simply the number of students that an institution serves. So this is it's in vogue with a lot of conservatives because they want accountability for higher education. But in a strange way, it could lead to a liberal result. And what do I mean by that? Well, in Tennessee, they've moved to a system where institutions are rewarded for graduating students. But they realize that, well, if we simply do that, then every institution will try to avoid low-income students because they're, on average, less likely to graduate. And so they changed the formula and said, well, we're going to give you extra money if you graduate low-income students. So they provide a 40% premium in the state funding for graduating students who are eligible for Pell Grants. And they're thinking about increasing that to 100% premium. So you'd actually get twice as much money for graduating low-income students. And it seems to me that could, there's a theory, at least, under which that could result in more four-year institutions recruiting low-income students because it would bring more funds into the college, and for the community colleges, which are now severely underfunded, it could provide the resources necessary to do well by students.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Rick. Marina, please.
Well, the news from the UK, and actually particularly from England, because Scotland has had the wisdom to separate its education policies from England. The news, therefore, from England is that we're trying as hard as we can to be exactly like you. We are trying to indebt all the students. We are trying to casualize all the faculty. We are trying to exclude the poor. And this is extremely bitter for us, my generation, and extremely bitter for the generations younger than mine. But I had the privilege of being educated entirely free, which was the case for every single person in the country at the higher level. You could choose to go to a private school and pay for it, secondary education, but if you wanted tertiary education, there was no private tertiary education. It was all state, and it was free. Now that was changed, surprisingly, by the Labour government. They introduced, because the numbers had grown considerably, which was the intention, they saw a hole in their finances. But this introduction of fees, which were fixed at a fairly low level and based on a student loan system, which I think is a bit like yours, has now increased. So we're now at a much higher level, £9,000 a year, which is very, very small compared to what I know you all pay, but it's going to be uncapped for certain, so there will be a free market competition between the universities. And the student debt is running extremely high, and the predictions are that it will default at a rate of something like nearly 50%. Thus indebting future generations. I mean, nobody will ever be able to get a loan, buy a house, etc. In the meantime, the ideology that has driven this paying for education actually has had much deeper and more damaging effects, particularly on research. Because research is no longer is so little state funded. Now, it may all be very foreign to your ears, this, because you're used to private. You have a different philanthropy philosophy than we have. So what has happened now is that research has been encouraged to be targeted at outputs, at particular identifiable results, usually and hopefully commercial. The effect on the humanities is absolutely catastrophic, because if you're going to do, as I, for example, would like to do at the moment, look at the what the literature of women poets was in the 9th century Baghdad, unless they're going to start deciding to sort of embed me in some in some spy operation on Islamic women. This is going to be of no use whatsoever. So STEM research is what they call STEM, the science, technology, economics, and mathematics, has been privileged. But actually, all my scientist colleagues and friends say that it is not very good there either. And I will give you one little anecdote just to show you the problem as it arises in England. So the Institute of Sustainable Development at one of the London universities was offered $1 million, actually, from an American company. This is the only case that I could find on record when looking at the effects of privatization of education on our research. It's the only case I found of someone resigning. The director of that institute resigned because the $1 million came from a fracking company. And she asked the fracking company, she didn't say she didn't want the money, she just asked the fracking company what would be the guarantees that the research undertaken by the Institute of Sustainable Development would be free of ideological bias. I mean, would they mind if fracking was found not to be sustainable? And she got no answer. So having got no answer, she actually resigned. But that is in capsule one of the problems. The freedom, exactly what Andy was talking about, the autonomy of the academic, the actual ability to think for yourself, independently of pressures, of teleological pressures and economic pressures, is being extremely seriously eroded in the country that created, after the war, one of the great social revolutions, and it is being thrown away. And so it is, I think, there was a very good article in the current New York Review of Books, as there often is, in which it discussed Max Planck's, as some of you will have seen it, Max Planck's responses, his marvelous career, but then his responses to the Nazis. And there were various alternatives given. And one of the alternatives that was given was speaking. And that's why, though I would far prefer to go back to my poems and to my reading and to the things I want to do and enjoy, I think that it's important to speak out. I found writing about this situation extremely uncomfortable. I felt very disloyal to the institution. That's another thing that is an important aspect of the passivity of the academic. I'm completely right what you say. Andy's completely right when he says that faculty don't engage. But part of it is actually a very misplaced loyalty. They don't want to. My colleagues don't want to fight. They don't want to make a fuss. You know, Laurent Berlant wrote a very good book called Cruel Optimism. They're cruel optimists, self-harming optimists. Thank you.
I want to back up and go to a somewhat more abstract level, because it seems to me that part of what's problematic about the future of higher education is there's a question about what kind of idea of the university we have, and the extent to which the ideas that certainly I was raised on date back to 19th century models. And I think if I look at them with a gimlet eye, those models are falsified in the real world. My father taught at the University of Chicago. I was raised on a Hutchins theory of the importance of general education and great books. This summer I was teaching for 2 weeks in Dresden and wandered past the Humboldt University in Berlin. And I want to start by reminding us of Humboldt's vision of the modern university, which was enormously influential in the West and including in the United States. To start with, there's a kind of assumption that will, I think, seem naive to most of us, that the ordering of the academic disciplines mirrors the order of the cosmos, and that this provides a pattern that can shape and form enlightened citizens that will create an enlightened nation state. That kind of assumption, the picture is not the picture that most of us have of the world today, but I was curious to go back and see what are the kind of pillars of what Humboldt suggested. So I went to the website of Humboldt University in Berlin, and they talk about the mission, and there are 3 assumptions that are crucial to the Humboldt University, and I'm going to question each of them shortly in turn. 1, the Humboldt University was to introduce the unity of research and teaching. 2, it was to uphold the ideal of research without restrictions. This is the autonomous inquiry we're talking about. 3, it was to provide a comprehensive education for its students, general education. Now, in turn, if I look around me today, and I have in mind the fate of my oldest son, who is an inorganic chemist at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So I'm very mindful of what an alternative universe those in the hard sciences occupy to those of us in the humanities and social sciences. First of all, unity of research and teaching, you must be kidding. My colleagues in the humanities and the social sciences would prefer not to teach at all. They would prefer to write their books and give their lectures, and I'm doing a self-study for the politics department at the New School. They chronically complain about how research is undervalued. And these are colleagues who actually have very little contact with undergraduates. The idea that researchers want to teach is, on the face of it, in every discipline I can know, it's just not true. The only way you could make it true is what they do at the University of North Carolina, which I think is very praiseworthy, is in the sciences they make all of their research professors teach undergraduates. That's not a requirement at most universities. The opposite is the case. Number 2, inquiry without restriction. In the period of the post-war, and ever since going back to the Bayh-Dole Act of the 70s, which created research clusters around universities like MIT and Stanford, this idea of unrestricted inquiry has been greatly diminished, most particularly in the hard sciences. And again, I know this from the experience of my son, who went to University of Chicago and then Caltech. At Caltech, his research was funded by BP. He's at Caltech doing his graduate research. BP actually hedges its bets. It wants to invest in renewable energy sources. It's what my son is doing primary research on. The other source of grants that would be available to fund labs would be government, and they would come with similar kinds of political restrictions. I have another in-law who's working at Howard Hughes Research Institute in Malibu, and actually her research is funded by the same combination of corporate and government funding. The idea that there is an unrestricted inquiry, particularly in the hard sciences, is totally naive. And it goes far beyond questions of crass commercial output. It goes to the very core and sinews of what kind of inquiry happens in our society. Point number 3, comprehensive education. The last time that somebody prominently tried to rethink what every educated citizen should know was probably Hutchins at the University of Chicago. Prior to that, you had the example of Columbia, which Andy can speak to directly. But generally, when discussions about general education break out, it quickly becomes a matter of parsing out to different departments and disciplines who want their share of the pie to make sure that they have quotas that they fulfill so that they can continue to hire people. The notion of general education has devolved into complete fragmentation, and it's particularly typified by the fact that the situation I just described in the natural sciences and much of the literature complaining about higher education, nobody even talks about the natural sciences because they've just been put aside. And the idea that there is an encyclopedic intelligence that could be transmitted to students, which was Humboldt's great hope, people have given up trying. So I think that what I find disturbing is not just the pragmatic inequalities and problems that have been identified here, but the very idea of what a community of scholars could mean and what is feasible in this day and age, I think has to be revisited, because the Humboldt ideals, which can still stir me when I look around at the real world, I think they're completely dead in the water.
Well, this has been fun. Which worries me slightly, the fact that it hasn't been fun, because we're all here, we all believe in these institutions, we all teach and we're getting degrees, and we have hopes. Many of you, especially the students, want to stay around in this enterprise for the rest of your lives. So we seem to have described a situation that I think it's fair to say is a serious inflection point in the evolution of higher education. I think Andy was quite right early on to say there was a period, certainly in the United States and Great Britain, of course, and Europe, of golden age, and it's under serious threat, and probably it needs to be under serious threat in some respects. Certainly the fact that it was a very privileged enclave. But here's what I heard more generally. I heard the kind of the encroaching commercialization, the use of words like return on investment, the use of kind of monetizing research and monetizing actually the teaching activity itself. And so if you can buy it cheaper through adjuncts than full professors, why would you not do it if you're running something? So it's a kind of a business mentality, a business vocabulary that is kind of, that's what I've heard, sort of creeping into the higher education system. And along with that has been necessarily an increase in performance metrics, because that's what the business community does do. It says, okay, I'm going to make my investment in this firm if I believe I will get such and such a return, or if this is going to be the outcome. So the use, and this was particularly graphic in Marina's account of Essex, of a measurement system that sort of, and as soon as you kind of have a measurement system to measure things like quality of education and judgment and depth of knowledge, you shrivel those things a little bit. They're very hard to measure without some sort of redefining them to sort of fit the numbers. So I sort of feel that there was a big theme here in the kind of the notion of accountability, of outcomes, of consequences that would be somehow measured, and therefore we would know who to reward, which institutions to reward, which individuals to reward, and so forth. Now, and part of the analysis was that a great deal of this is self-inflicted. And you heard it again in all three of the presentations. I mean, some of this is us doing it to ourselves in order to get certain kinds of rewards, larger piles of research money, lower teaching loads in places that can get away with that, not being around to govern the institution because that's a nuisance. I'll give you my own anecdote. I taught for many years at the University of Chicago. I then left and did other kinds of things for about 20 years that were still kind of academic, but they were not on a campus. I came back then to Columbia, and the first thing I realized, it was inconceivable, no matter what the problem was and what the urgency was and what the importance was of an issue, to imagine a departmental meeting on a Saturday morning. When I left Chicago, we had departmental meetings if we needed to on a Saturday morning, and everybody was there. And then I sort of watched this more carefully, and I realized that you can't have a faculty meeting on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday or a Monday. You can on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And also, you couldn't get many courses on a Friday and or a Monday and obviously a Saturday, Sunday. So the entire higher education system, at least at Columbia, in this 20 years that I had not been paying attention to these things, had been squeezed into 3 days a week. Now, in the 2 semesters, there are only about 20, 25 weeks. 12, 13. That's 75 days. So this entire university is now, if you believed in faculty governance, it takes place in 75 days. So no wonder we have to turn it over to administrators, Andy. They're there every, they're there on Mondays and Fridays. And
7 till 11 at night.
Exactly, yeah, right. Anyway, sorry for the anecdote. I shouldn't have drifted into that. But there's a way in which that some of this has been brought on ourselves, especially I think in the elite institutions, and then that dribbles down, I think, the system. We've lost community, and in the process, and unexpectedly, we're losing autonomy. Now, if that's the picture that's been presented up here, each of the speakers now gets a chance to say, well, come on, I'm speaking on your behalf now. Tell us what to expect. Tell us where the avenues of advance are. Tell us what we can do to sort of rearrange the priorities of some of these things. I mean, we can't just sort of let this thing go. We'll wake up someday and the universities will be the University of Apple and the University of Google, and it won't be, us at all. And it'll be fully, with MOOCs. By the way, the MOOCs will be given by actors, not by us. They're much better at presentation. No, seriously. Why in the world would you have a faculty member do it if you could hire Alan Alda to give your, I'm sorry, that really dates me. I realize. I'm sure they're more important kind of, never mind. But I think we've got to be not optimistic, but we've got to somehow get into this conversation, kind of ways to go forward, or choices to make rather than self-inflicted wounds. So who will help us get started? Andy, go ahead.
Well, I'm not famous for cheery discourse, but it does seem to me might be useful just to remark that you could probably convene a panel like this at almost any moment in the history of higher education and get something like the same impression. Universities have been going to hell from the beginning of time. And it could be that process has accelerated, and I meant what I said, and I think a lot of other true things were said here. But you can find Thorsten Veblen over 100 years ago talking about how institutions, as Rick said, are in the business of competing for prestige, and how they are in the hands of the businessmen, and the last thing they're interested in is wisdom, truth, or knowledge. So we ought to just kind of keep that in mind, maybe as a slight potential source of solace. I guess, and I think much of what we're talking about is self-inflicted. I think Jim is quite right about the flight from the classroom on the part of people who can flee. He's quite right about the complete fragmentation of the idea of comprehensive education. I think he's probably largely right about the purposeful commercial motives behind a lot of research. So I suspect it might be a little more room for pure research out there than he suggested, but he knows more about that than I do. But I guess my broader observation is that it's not accidental that we're having this conversation at a moment when we have the confluence of two phenomena in our country. Ken said we could talk mainly about the United States, which is the only place I know anything about. We have made a sort of a good faith effort at providing something between mass and universal higher education. And as Rick quite rightly pointed out, we have a terrible stratification problem within that effort, but we have made that effort since the Second World War. And for a while it was going pretty well, and now it's stalled or has gone into reverse. And that's, I think, in large part, yes, the self-inflicted stuff, but it's because of the economic reality. We have relative to the post-war boom, we have a stagnant economy. We have people who are struggling to get into or stay in the middle class. And therefore, the way things are structured right now, we can't pay for all the things that we want. And all the good things that we want are on the list of things that we can't pay for. Now, we probably believe that our priorities are all wrong, and we should be redirecting resources toward the kind of educational experience that has been put forward here. But we have an economic reality in the background of this conversation. And so I guess my conclusion is, given my somewhat shaky faith in the ability of academic institutions to reform themselves, the best thing that could happen to us is for the economy to get better. For a thriving China to reemerge, for renewable energy resources to be developed, and then suddenly people could relax a little bit, and maybe the kind of general education ideal that Jim is talking about would not seem like a luxury to so many people, and we'd have a little more breathing room the way we did in the middle of the 20th century. So I hope that'll happen.
Go ahead, Marina.
I do think that, I mean, I agree with you, but I think that there's a first step which needs to be taken, and that's a political step, and that is considering what kind of economy you wish to grow. And the kind of economy that at the moment is growing is not the kind of economy that is going to deliver distribution of wealth across, and that we've been seeing, and this is true also of Europe, the diminution of the middle classes, simply their reserves, their resources, their savings, their children's their children's prospects, etc. So there's an enormous disparity between the very rich and the poor all over the world. And that is an effect of politics. It's not an effect of it's an effect of the choices made by politicians. And we've actually had, just to give you an anecdotal example, the current ministry that oversees the higher education in Britain, that's the whole of Britain, is called the Department of Business, Innovations and Skills. It does not have the word universities in its title. It has a minor ministry called the Ministry of Universities within its umbrella. One of the first things that Jeremy Corbyn, the new Labour leader, said he would do is change the name of the ministry that actually looked after higher education, because it's a priority. At the same time that he was elected, oddly enough, Angela Merkel in Germany decided to abolish fees for all university education. Why did she do that? I mean, she is showing a philanthropic streak these days, but that's not why she did it. She did it because she knows that prosperity follows from education, and that if you have an educated middle class, you don't need China. You need people who can think across the board of your society, and you need to train them. And this is the best investment you could. It's not my reason for wanting people to be educated. I want people to be educated so their lives are richer. But one of the reasons for a state to educate is because it will lead to prosperity. The indexes are absolutely clear, and we know it from looking at countries like Africa. What do we say in countries in Africa that have poor levels of education? We say, let's educate them, or let them get educated so that prosperity will become greater.
And I think we've even lost that concept in this country. I mean, when President Obama, whom I admire a great deal, talks about higher education, it's mostly as a private good, right? So he has all this information out there now. The Department of Education has published about what your wages will be, what your salary will be if you go to X institution and if you major in this subject. And if that's the whole point, then it's no surprise that the public is disinvesting from higher education. Right, so 80% of students attend public institutions of higher education in this country. And for years and years, we put money in because everyone would benefit. This was a public good. People were more likely to vote. We'd have a better democracy. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons. But when we reduce the concept to, well, individuals are going to have higher wages, then it's not surprising that the public, when taught that that's what higher education is for, says, well, the individual student then should pay for it. Why should I pay for it if it's all about how this individual will prosper economically? So that might be one starting point for our politicians to talk about education in a different way than they are today, even our liberal politicians.
Yeah, just to underline what Rick said, if you don't know about this, it's called a college scoreboard. It's just been issued by the administration, and it takes hundreds of colleges and universities in the United States. And it's a very, very clever piece of work, by the way, empirically, because what they did was they were able to attach people's earnings where they went to school to their real earnings by using IRS data and other kind of survey data that the government has access to. And so it's a very nifty piece of work. However, it totally makes the purpose of education income and careers. There is no measure of will they be a better parent? Will they be a better citizen? Will they be a better, a more intelligent consumer of the arts? Better member of their community? And because you can't, so that you're left to measure what you can measure. And so I think part of the problem we have is that we've got to, look, I directed the census, I believe in numbers. But the part of the problem is we have to get judgment back into the system and not just numerical targets. And if we could simply argue our way past some of these performance metrics somehow and say, let's let people just exercise judgment about what makes the most sense, we can roll some of the processes back. And it is a disappointment, to me anyway, that this administration went where it did on the college scoreboard. Jim?
I think it's absolutely right that this is in part a political problem, but in thinking about the politics, it seems to me that we have to step back and not just look at higher education. Certainly in the United States, I was asked a couple of years ago to respond to a report prepared for the Council on Foreign Relations entitled U.S. Education Reform and National Security, that it was prepared by Joel Klein and Condoleezza Rice. And in this report, which is about 100 pages, the word liberal never appears. There is no reference to liberal arts or liberal education. It's all about assessment and about outcomes. The whole assessment movement in the United States grew out of K through 12 assessment endeavors. And I think that in many cases in a modern society such as the United States, the core rationale for liberal arts training to extend the horizons of children and introduce them to a very wide range of disciplines and possibilities, there's more at stake and a stronger argument to be made for making sure this happens at the K through 12 level. And actually, I think if I were to pick a place to enter the battle, I think higher education, for the reasons I've already said about, to me, the obsolescence of the Humboldt idea in practice, is that we need to go back to an earlier phase in education where the politics are in many ways even more intractable, but I think that that's where you have to join the battle. And try to defend the liberal arts in primary education as a way to offer students a full range of opportunities to see what gifts they may actually possess. It's really shocking, this report. It says nothing about the performing arts. It says nothing about, all the literature that they suggest should be read is utilitarian. Imaginative literature isn't even part of what they think is important. And I think that there's, Arnie Duncan was part of the problem of the Obama admin, and this was his kind of talk.
I'm going to shift just slightly and ask the panelists to reflect on what's a really, I think, at least for me, a very difficult question. The metaphor of the ivory tower it was suggestive of the fact that a faculty was free, removed from society, removed from a certain set of responsibilities in order to think creatively. It wasn't that they weren't to be engaged, but they were to be engaged on their terms, not on terms that were set external to the university sector, and also to teach, as they were, as Andy said, motivated to teach and so forth. So let's just for the moment say there's a kind of a value attached to autonomy in the evolution of the higher education system over the last, since 1750 and so forth. On the other hand, there is an issue of accountability, especially if it is going to be public monies. And one of the things that I think has happened is a growing sense that we have to hold these people accountable for their how they spend their time, because they're not as trustworthy as we thought they were. They really do. Lots and lots of stories now of conflict of interest. Lots of stories of scientific fraud, of manipulation. The peer review system isn't as robust as we claimed that it was. Things don't replicate. All the kind of self-inflicted wounds we talked about, people not wanting to be there more than 3 days a week. It's not the fact they don't work hard. I think across the board, at all levels, they work very, very hard. But it doesn't feel that way from the outside. We've seen these endless state legislative debates about they only teach 4 hours, for heaven's sakes. Why don't they teaching 8 hours? That most people have to work 8 hours a day or what have you, and so forth. So there's a way in which and this goes back to the golden period. The golden period came out of the Second World War, when the scientific scholarly community, including, I should say, social scientists and humanists, though not in as large number as the scientists, really proved 3 things to the country. They were loyal citizens. They dropped what they were doing and worked on behalf of the war effort. And they gave us the bomb, and they gave us radar, and they gave us code breaking, and they gave us propaganda analysis, and so forth. And they gave us actually important historical lessons about the people we were fighting, especially in North Africa and so forth. So they were good patriots. Secondly, they could produce. The stuff was really on a fast time frame. Really exciting what happened and the things I just mentioned. And third, and quite important, they had a mechanism for self-governing, self-policing. They knew how to find the best people. They knew how to get fraud out of the system. They knew how to watch for conflicts of interest, peer review processes, and so forth and so on. So on these 3 pillars, we really launched the new stage, if you will, of higher education, all the money that came through NSF and NIH to the universities and so forth, at least the research universities. All 3 of those things, the loyalty, the self-sacrifice, the capacity to self-govern, and the productivity, certainly for at least in some parts of our work, are questioned, whether it's fair to question or not. So it's easy to see why you begin to get an accountability regime rather than a kind of an autonomy regime under those kinds of circumstances. So just struggle with that problem.
If I think you raise, as you say, a difficult and important point. I mean, I have all the allergies against the assessment regime that have been mentioned here, but I think, if I understand Ken's provocation correctly, the public is not entirely wrong to distrust academic institutions, broadly speaking. It is, in my experience, and I'm sure I exemplify it in some occasions, academics like to hear themselves talk. And they'll talk, given the opportunity to do so in front of students and not maybe listen so terribly well and engage in productive discussion. Academics like to replicate themselves. It's my impression that a lot of professors, when they teach undergraduates, are looking out there to see who is likely to be most like them, and not thinking very much about the complexity and variety of lives that their students may be heading into, and the extremely low likelihood that any of them will become academic. Academics are, ironically enough, quite conservative. I mean, it is true that they probably mostly vote on the left liberal side of the political spectrum, but my experience inside institutions is that they're very uneasy about change. They're very defensive. They're very territorial. I'm making terrible generalizations here. We all know and love people who are exceptions. But so they don't really want to be told, well, you know, maybe you could be teaching this subject a little more effectively, or maybe your students have changed from a generation ago and need a different kind of approach. And academics, the lucky ones, love to become celebrities, you know, and to get on TV and so on. So there are a lot of reasons. I mean, even if what I just said is a slander to a lot of people and is only 40 or 50% true, there are reasons for the public to be suspicious of what goes on inside academic institutions. And one other point along these lines, you started out with Ivory Tower. One of the other very significant differences between the institutions of the Golden Age and the institutions of today is that they have absolutely no connection to the military.
Yes.
None. We have actually at Columbia quite a few students who are veterans because of our School of General Studies, but that's rather anomalous. But, you know, since the rise of the volunteer army and the end of the civilian draft, I mean, the university might as well I mean, it's in a world where nobody's at war. Nobody's...
Unless you're at MIT.
Yeah, well, okay, that's right. There are linkages, but you know, I mean, we live in a completely insulated universe, and that has something to do, I think, with the fact that there's neither any participation in the war effort on the part of students in selective colleges, certainly, who by and large don't go into the military, nor is there any protest against the war effort to speak of. No protest against the Iraq and Afghanistan wars comparable to what we saw in the Vietnam era, because nothing is at stake for most of the people in the universities.
Can I just comment too? So I write a lot about K through 12 education, and I've seen, I agree with you, Jim. I mean, the metrics have been so narrow in that context that we're not teaching art and lots of things that that we ought to be examining, and that's what worries me here. Andy wrote a fabulous book called College. I took all these notes, Andy. I was telling you beforehand because I wanted to review it. Here it is. Yeah, there's the copy. And he taught. There are a couple things about that he said. You know, college is a place where young people are navigating the territory between adolescence and adulthood. It should help them develop certain qualities of mind and heart requisite for reflective citizenship. You know, college should be an aid to reflection, a place and process whereby young people take stock of their talents and passions and begin to sort out their lives in a way that is true to themselves and responsible to others. Now, see, I think that's a beautiful concept. How on earth would a test try to capture that? I mean, it seems to me at the end of the day, the one thing that higher education can still say that speaks to the kind of the business metrics that folks are looking for is that the premium, the wage premium associated with a bachelor's degree continues to rise over time. You know, I'm talking broadly. There are blips here and there, but over time it has continued to rise. And that suggests that something of value, of economic value, in the what politicians are focusing on, is being provided by higher education. So in a way, as kind of the No Child Left Behind Act comes to higher education, that could be a defense that, you know, on your own metrics, for those in the political sphere, the bachelor's degree continues to provide economic value.
Thank you. I'm going to let Marina and Jim weigh in on this issue, and then I will open it up to the audience. Marina?
Well, I just wanted to say there was one other aspect that perhaps arises from this idea of accountability, and that is that you in the United States are not, we have become in Britain part of Europe, and it actually it affects higher education very profoundly. But there is a rising feeling of the current government is second-guessing all the time the rising temperature of anti-foreign feeling and anti-European feeling in the country, which they probably overestimate. But they're very, very scared of our right-wing movement, the UKIP, Independence Party, who did well at the polls, not very well, but they're frightened of them, and so they keep trying to move to capture that feeling. And while at the same time they're bringing in a lot of foreign students, because the foreign students pay more, so they're milked regardless of their actual abilities, and sometimes their language skills are not what they should be to take a course in English. But while they're doing that in a cynical fashion, there's also large tendency for the administrators to weigh in to close down international programs. And that has been really very, very serious. The idea that we are an open country and that one of the benefits of education is cross-border and cross-cultural discussion. So it's not just a good for the country that we're in, but a good for the larger world, that it builds reciprocity, it builds relationships. This is being quite severely eroded.
I want to answer directly your question about autonomy and the autonomy regime, because I think there are many paradoxes of how that actually plays out. But let me go back to the idea that Humboldt had, that there should be research without restriction. If you go down that path, you unleash hyper-specialization and fragmentation, because that's the nature of inquiry in the last couple hundred years. So the assumption that there would be cohesiveness and generalizations that you could render out of research, which is the core of the Humboldt vision, simply isn't true in practice. And what happens in then the modern university is you have a real split between the hard sciences and the humanities and the social sciences. On the one hand, you have the kind of craft workshop model in which people become very jealous of their guild privileges and under the aegis of autonomy. And then you have, in other departments, big science that involve very costly collaborations. And this, involves, this isn't just commercial, this is primary research in fields like astronomy and so forth. And so that in practice what happens is that when you go to a faculty and say, let's revise the gen ed requirements, or if you go to a department and say, let's look at our curriculum, you not only find people who are unwilling to do the work of shared faculty governance, but they're very reluctant to do service courses. It seems beneath them because they're completely devoted to research. This is the nature of, it seems to me inevitable if you protect the autonomy of research, that you're going to end up in this pickle. And that's why I think that as a counter movement, you generate these kind of weird experiments like Minerva School, where Stephen Kosselin, frustrated by his Harvard colleagues won't even do service courses, gets together 20 people, they design what they think the gen ed courses should be, and they hire casual laborers to teach to the template because they can't make the faculty do it because they have autonomy.
If there are audience questions, what you should do is find one of the two microphones. They're on both sides of the room. If you stand at those microphones, I'll go back and forth, left to right or right to left, depending. If you could, we'll start with one that can just shout if you want to, if you think everyone will hear you. You don't have to go.
I have a loud enough voice, I don't need a microphone.
Yeah, go ahead. Make sure go ahead. But stand up, make sure everybody in the back can hear you as well.
What's been said by the panel strikes me as being, for the most part, very congenial to my way of thinking. Maybe I should preface my comment by saying that I've been teaching the humanities for over 50 years. And that includes all freshman classes through postdoctoral. I have 35 postdoctoral students at 5 prestigious universities. So that's my perspective. The thing that I found missing from the discussion are encapsulated in 2 words: idealism and self-sacrifice. When you could you take up these 2 words as they bear on what you said in your comments or in your presentations? This is what I, after 50 years in this, find missing. Not just among faculty, but among administrators and among the public, the people that fund these universities.
Thank you. I'm going to take more than one question, and then different panel members can address which particular ones they would like to. We'll start over here then.
Hi, my question is very related, so hopefully that helps. I have heard a lot of, we've problematized very well, so the title delivered. on what we have done, but we haven't provided many solutions, mostly because we've been talking about other people who aren't willing to work with us, and I feel like that's a huge cop-out. And what I had initially wanted to ask was, as someone who's entering the job market, what advice do you have to those of us who don't want to recreate these struggles and want to imagine something different and want to use imagination to move forward, even though we have the constraints of debt and little sway, but maybe take away those constraints? What is your imagination for how this gets better? What is the university that doesn't do these things?
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, I wanted to ask what your thoughts are about the boot camps, the programming, data science, these intensive boot camps that have sprung about because they felt that traditional universities didn't actually prepare students to go out into their job and do these technical skills.
Go ahead.
Hi, my question is regarding kind of addressing the inequality between faculty and adjunct instructors. And if anyone could comment on perhaps PhD programs offering separate paths, one for research, one for teaching, and the likelihood of that being adopted by the academy in terms of creating those types of positions.
Please, one more, then we'll stop.
I'm Alec Gershberg from the Urban Policy Program at the New School. I'd like to piggyback on the first comment from the young woman over there, but I guess since I'm a tenured faculty member, I can say, wow, what a bummer. I mean, I get it, and I get where the panel is coming from, and it is called the problematic future of higher ed, but I'd like to hear something beyond, that it's a political problem, something that's within the power of universities the way they're governed now, that can let us know what a good future for the university might look like. What can we do? And, I know this means thinking a little bit about business models, right? We haven't really mentioned anything about the business model of the university, but costs haven't just been going up, and tuition just hasn't been going up because of draconian administrators who are trying to wring more out of student debt. There are serious business model issues that need to be addressed, and I think aside from the Apple U or Google U quip, I didn't hear much about what potential innovative futures could be for the university.
Sure, thanks. So I'll ask the panelists, not everybody to answer everyone, but to pick one that you would like to address.
Well, I'll put my foot in it. The gentleman who said he'd like to hear something about idealism and self-sacrifice, one observation that connects to what Jim was saying, I mean, that moment, that we're calling the golden moment, there was something more resembling a consensus about comprehensive or general education about 50 or 60 years ago. And if you went to the elite institutions, you would have found many of the leading faculty teaching large undergraduate courses at the expense of their research time, because they had a different sensibility than what we have now. I don't know how to explain that. You hear a lot of talk about idealism and self-sacrifice from academic leaders, but forgive me, when you have presidents compensated $3, $4, $5 million a year, sitting on multiple corporate boards, and then preaching to the students about self-sacrifice and going back and working in the community, why should anybody believe them? I mean, it's sheer hypocrisy. And people are sensitive to that and aware of it. So I think that's a way to segue perhaps into a more positive comment, which is I think leadership can make a difference. If we had leadership that actually took a position against the pernicious effects of the ranking system and say, you know what, we're willing to drop 5 or 6 slots in U.S. News. We want to increase the percentage of low-income students in our institution by 5% over the next 3 years, and we don't care if we drop 5 or 6 slots. I think the public would be impressed. I think students would pay attention in a way that they don't now. And so what if you drop a few slots and you take 9% of your applicants instead of 7%? But, I've been waiting around to hear a university president take that position, and I haven't heard one yet.
Well, I have heard a couple. We have at Amherst, Tony Marks, who's obviously now here in New York as the head of the public library. When he was at Amherst, he did double the percentage of Pell Grant students. And Cappy Hill at Vassar has made a lot of progress too. It takes leadership though, because there were some hard decisions that had to be made in order to fulfill that promise. But I mean, fundamentally, education is supposed to be about, social mobility and social cohesion, right? Social mobility, we're supposed to provide genuine equal opportunity for students of all backgrounds to enjoy the fruits of excellent educations. And so having, and Marx felt that it was inappropriate for Amherst to essentially be excluding a whole segment of society. And so he took that step. And the other thing I'll mention, Andy did pay me quite a bit to keep mentioning his book, but there was a line in there where you said the Columbia professors gave back some of their salary in order to stay need blind. I don't know if that was in the golden era or if it was more recent.
It was almost exactly 30 years ago. Okay. And just the faculty in which that action took place no longer exists. Mm-hmm. That is, there was a faculty of those who taught primarily undergraduates doesn't exist anymore, and the faculty, both by its own action and by the fact that the administration has allowed the Committee on Admission and Financial Aid to disappear, is completely ignorant of the fact that the percentage of students at my institution receiving financial aid has been declining, even as we've been raising billions of dollars to build a new campus. That makes me upset, but I'm tired of talking about it uptown because nobody seems interested.
Go ahead.
Leaders, I think, are obviously people of distinctive qualities, but I think they are created by followers. It is the mass of people who wishes that leader to be leading that allows it to happen. I mean, that's what his democracy is about. And I think that one of the ways that we can create and either go back or create a more idealistic university is by mobilizing that opinion. And I think there are some, in the British situation, we have very, very high differentials between the administrators and the academics. That opinion should mass to resist that. In some cases, it's 40 to 1. I mean, a teacher who's actually doing several hours teaching will be earning 40 times less than the administrator. I mean, this is absolutely unconscionable. And then I think that there should be the ratio, the numbers, of course, of managers to teachers. It should also become unacceptable that the ratio should be in excess of something. I mean, it has to be fixed. So that the academic institution should be primarily doing academic business. You need some administrators, but you don't need so many, and they certainly should not be paid in these vast differentials more than, because it's driving a lot of academics who haven't possibly starred, in England anyway, it's driving a lot of academics who haven't possibly become, television stars or whatever, into administration where they earn so much more. So it's much more attractive to be an administrator in salary terms. So I think there are some practical solutions, in fact. And I actually would not, I mean, we may not have been talking about idealism, but certainly my experience of my colleagues is that the reason people are still in it is because actually idealism drives them. They are possessed still by idealism. Mm-hmm. And they're surrounded by cynics. There's the administrators who prey on that idealism.
Well, no, I think we're going to. One of the things you said, we don't listen enough to.
Well, I wanted very quick response to the young woman who said going on the job market and what could we say. Just that going around the country, one discovers there are a lot of wonderful institutions out there. They're just under the radar. And some of them are faith-based institutions where actually, ironically, I've felt more freedom in the classroom than in some of our most elevated secular institutions. So I'm just a piece of advice. Look widely, and you will find a lot of idealism in a lot of colleges, maybe outside the metropolitan area.
So, let me do another quick round of questions. So start over here, please.
Could I have?
What? Oh.
Do I have to go to a microphone?
Well, you don't have to, but there are about 11 people that had their hand. I'm sorry, before you had your hand up.
If I could, please.
Make it a question, please.
The university does not exist in a vacuum, and we are influenced by politics, Supreme Court politics, big bucks, money, and we have many different aspects to be dealing with. And so I think this has been a remarkable panel, and I've really enjoyed this very much. And I've been involved as both a tenured, not tenured, but a full-time faculty and an adjunct for many years now, and now retired. But I have seen so much change, and mass education was initially the first thing that was supposed to be taking place in this country when it was formed. All education for everybody, and things have changed and evolved as money got into it. In the corporate, we are now dealing with corporate structures in higher education, where we talked about the fact that the faculty was not even deciding on what's happening. We were simply told to teach this and don't teach that, and we get rid of this program because it's not fitting now with where the money is to be coming in.
Yes, no, thank you, but it's a little unfair to all the people who did try to answer questions.
I would like to address this in totality. The students are in Cooper Union, which is where I wanted to get to, have long never paid any tuition. Money came in and big buildings were built, and now they're going to have to pay tuition. What is the university?
Please.
Hi, my name is Ellen Schrecker, and I've been writing about higher education for quite a while. And I'm now writing about the 60s. And one of the things that, as a historian, I've noticed, and it goes back to the 60s, is the incredible demonization of faculty out there in the public discourse. It's something that I think has contributed, not caused. I think the cause is economic, as most of the panelists have noted. But it certainly contributed to this pulling back of resources. Why are we going to pay these people who are, you know, filling students' heads with socialism and multiculturalism and all these bad things? So it is a political problem here, and I'm just wondering, and it's also now against, of course, unions. I mean, we're seeing, there was something in a recent Inside Higher Ed and Chronicle of Higher Education about what's going on in Connecticut, where the administration is beginning to bargain the union contract and is going to have provisions. It's a system. There are several schools being lumped together here, where a faculty member can be sent from his or her original school to some other school.
No, thank you, but if you have a question, we would like to get
and
it.
the question is, how do we combat that?
Okay, thank you. You want to help us combat it? Yeah.
No. I am going to point out two observations about modern universities which I don't agree, I don't believe was brought up in this conversation at all, and then my question will be, what do you think of those things with regard to the topic at hand? Number one, the Anglo-American university is so different from the university in Europe and many other parts of the world in that it is separated from the community by a wall, and it lives on this campus. Oddly enough, there are three institutions down here that don't have campuses, all within about a half a mile of one another. It's NYU, the New School, and Cooper Union. But they're exceptional. Most Anglo-American schools in England and here in the United States have campuses. Okay, the other thing is the organization of institutions of higher learning. That has been evolving over the last 200 years at the same time that government organization has been evolving and industrial organization and corporations have been evolving, and they all take the same model. From 1815 to now, it used to be just like a group of people working together. Now, it's all a hierarchical model. You've got some chief up on top, and you've got the pawns at the bottom. Where do they get this from? The military, which has been around for thousands of years, and the Catholic Church, which was around for about 1,000 years. Hierarchical organizations adopted by the university, industry, and local and national government. And that's it.
Thank you. Over here, please.
Hi, my name is Zoe Carey. I'm a PhD student here at the New School, and I think the perspective of students was really missing from this panel. I think you had a lot of things to say about students, but they really kind of took on this passive image as just they are getting into debt and they don't have opportunities, as opposed to looking at what students are actually doing. I think, Andrew, you even mentioned that there is no mass student movement on campuses. And one thing that I think is important to note is that students today are usually working jobs in order to afford to go to university. And I'm not just talking about students that are, lower socioeconomic status. I'm talking about graduate students. I'm an employee here at the New School, and I'm part of an organization that's I'm part of a union that's trying to get recognized from this university so that we can sit down and collectively bargain over our labor conditions. I know there's also a union at Columbia and a number of other private universities throughout the Northeast. I would be really interested to hear about kind of the role of the student as both student and employee. Unfortunately, I guess none of you will necessarily be able to comment on that, but I think it's something very important that we should hear about.
Please.
Bob Larrick. I wanted to thank you and the group and the Center for Public Scholarship for this panel and work. I just came from a mental health education group, General Semantics. I work with the UN NGO community and the politicians on meaningful UN renewal. I've been trying to get an institute on good government interfaith alliance to work together better. But the cultural issues and the need for a new logic. One of the things at this General Semantics at the Princeton Club, the mental health education, the theme was language and reality. The issue of science, it was based upon this manhood of humanity. How do we evolve the human condition? The second was science and sanity, which relates to these things. What are we doing? What type of cultures are we creating? And if the scientific method requires us to go back at our logic and to see what we're doing, how we're conceptualizing our cultures and systems, and if we're not getting the right results, to go back and reconceptualize. You brought up the economic issues. By the way, your Columbia University has some, as well as this one, has some good, very good economists, Stiglitz and Sachs, who talk about these issues. Also, the SIPA at Schwartz Center here also brings up actually the Matic and integrity issues. But the issue of a different logic and the politics and understanding of, frankly, reality in our systems, if it's not working for the middle class generally, and perhaps the issue of violence and security is a way to
we're going to need your question because it's a little unfair.
Logic, I'm sorry, yes. Is logic, do we need a new logic as part of the whole university system, how we evaluate and measure emotional intelligence, the amount of violence within our individuals, human relations generally? How do we live with each other as ethical, rational, humanistic individuals as part of what Albert Ellis Institute for Mental Health is about?
That's a big question. And fortunately, the center has, as most of you know, done a very large number of different kinds of programs. And so my guess is we won't get to that or some of the other questions, but if I could do the advertisement for the center and the journal, Social Research, if you look through the social research journals, you will find quite a few that are addressing these issues. Please, over here, and then we're going to, I would think, except for nobody else get in line. In fact, some of you who are in line aren't going to quite make it. Go ahead, please.
Just a quick question. As a graduate student myself as well, I was just wondering if anybody in the panel could put themselves once again, as we heard, in our shoes. And then just a quick question. If you were in our position, would you get into academia today?
I'll answer that.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm going to get one more question over here, and then we'll. Nobody else line up over there until we answer that question. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon. the K-12 system is the preparatory ground for students entering higher education. What we are seeing is a rise of students when they do enter college. They are not prepared, and they are forced to be in remedial or developmental classes. Are there conversations with regard to higher education somewhat creating a pipeline or some kind of integration where students in K-12 can be better prepared when they do come to higher education?
The short answer is certainly yes, but it's a short answer. But we'll see if other people can elaborate on it. But there are a lot of pipeline strategies out there. I'm going to let, you've been a long time up there, so you ask, and then that will end the questions, I'm afraid. Please.
Well, my question is on the limits of free speech in higher education, both public and private institutions. That is really a developing trend. And as you know, the University of Chicago and also Cornell came out very strongly, against this tendency by the bureaucratic, commercial, administrations to, want to regulate and control, yes. Free expression, to maintain order. This is a real serious problem. If you're going to limit the First Amendment and assembly and all these type of things, yes. I mean, that's basic to education. Yeah. So I want to ask you about that. Yeah. Oh, incidentally, just looking at some of the social research catalogs over here, it's phenomenal. This one, I mean, the whole, what I just discussed, yep. It runs through most of these things. Good. Social research. I'm not a member of New School, but I mean, yeah. All these different things about free speech are in these things. It's incredible. It's marvelous.
Yeah. I would just, we won't try to answer I'll quickly answer part of what you said about the academic freedom on the university campuses. I would put that on the list of self-inflicted wounds. It's one of the things that we brought on for ourselves. We don't have a kind of conversation that's as open as we would like it to be, and we end up sort of compromising free speech on our own campuses. But it's not imposed on from the outside, it's being built from the inside. The biggest debate that's going on at the University of Chicago on this issue is the IRBs, which had a very deep, important origin to sort of protect human subjects, but it's gotten to the point where it really is curtailing research. So these are all things that we're doing internally rather than they're being imposed from outside by evil corporations and so forth. So I think the university own university behavior is part of our problem. I'm going to let everybody pick one thing. I'm going to start with Jim because he wants to directly say whether he would today become an academic.
No. And as a person who runs an MA program, I always ask my applicants to think twice and thrice about whether this is a sound decision for them to make. The job opportunities are so diminished in the social sciences and humanities that what's been referred to here as the golden age it just doesn't exist anymore. And I got through graduate school on the last wave. I was basically paid by the Defense Department as part of Sputnik money to read critical theory. And then it dawned on the government that maybe that wasn't a wise investment of funds, for various political reasons. And so those days are gone. And it's, I'm just being straight and honest with you. I mean, I would say no.
Okay. To the point about student voices needing to be heard, I completely agree. I think we've tried within the limits of who we are and what our topic has been to suggest that some of us are worried, or all of us are worried, that students are being shortchanged in a number of different ways, financially, pedagogically, and otherwise. But you're quite right, and I think students do have a very important role to play in what we hope will be the reform of these institutions. As for the unionization, graduate student unionization movement, I will say that my thinking on this has evolved, not that that matters particularly, but that as we see graduate study going from an apprenticeship model to a employment model, That is to say, as Jim says, the jobs are not there, even if you're waving this promise in front of the students' eyes, and graduate students are being used by the institution to teach undergraduates. I think the unionization movement has a real place, and I think it's a likely development, and we'll see it happening, and I'm guessing it'll be a healthy one. Just one last thing. I did not say that there weren't any mass student protest movements on campus. I said specifically that there hadn't been anything particularly focused on the wars that we've come through in the last few years, and I think that's a true statement.
Rick, do you want to add something?
Sure. So there were a lot of questions there, and I probably won't get into the, to the extent to which the Roman Catholic Church is responsible for the hierarchy in universities. But let me pick up on one of the early comments on the demonization of faculty, because I think there is a real political agenda there, and it ties in to what others have been saying about online education. If you look at the governors who are most enthusiastic about online learning, it's Rick Perry, Rick Scott, and Scott Walker. There is a clear agenda here. These are folks who not only don't like faculty, they don't like unions. They're looking for a way to educate large numbers of students on the cheap. And I think the demonization of the faculty is all wrapped into that. I guess returning to this theme of stratification, we already have a two-tiered system with gross inequalities between the 4-year and the 2-year institutions, and I'm really worried that that certain governors are going to push us further to add a third tier of online education, which will take the inequality that community college students now face and kind of add steroids to it. This will be the way that we educate low-income students in the future, and I think it's very, very disturbing.
Marina, please.
Yes, well, I feel that many of the questions actually relate to the concept of the precariat, which I think is Chomsky's term for a kind of community of people who are desperately worried about how they're going to survive, and that certainly the students facing the jobs market. And it just seems to me that, and also it's connected to silence, the silencing of many people in the universities, which is very striking, is also because of this precarious condition people find themselves in. So it seems to me that they are all connected, and it's a question of seizing voice and feeling confident of actually speaking out. And it's very striking that the PhD student spoke in that way. It is the way forward, definitely, to build up the resistance so that certain steps cannot be taken without real shame. People have to face real shame and real confrontation with resistance. Too much compliance.
I'm going to also answer one of the questions as a final comment. It was the issue about going forward. What can we offer? I actually think that higher education today in Anglo-American and with some of our European colleagues especially, it will be much more difficult to do this, I think, in China, India, and other places, but with our European colleagues. We have to embrace accountability and say we are prepared to be accountable, and then we have to argue for the things we want to be accountable about as a community. And they will have to be things like free expression. They will have to be things like reducing inequalities in our student body. They will have to be about things like fair treatment of faculty. They will have to be, but they are not about protecting our privileges. They're about protecting a set of principles that we can engage around. I think we can identify those principles, and I think that we can come up with an accountability assessment system that will not be reduced to silly metrics of this, that, and the other, but will be able to speak to those kinds of issues. And I think if we sort of try to retreat to autonomy, we're going to lose. If we simply retreat, say, leave us alone, we know what we're doing, we're the faculty, we're universities, and so forth and so on, I think we will lose to the Rick Perrys and Ted Cruz and so forth. But I think if we can really say we understand why we have to be accountable for the taxpayer dollar, we have to be accountable for the students if we're taking their tuition money, we have a serious responsibility, and here's how we would like to be accountable. And they would have to be about principles that would be widely shared, and they cannot be highly privileged, self-protecting set of principles. So that's how I think actually we can practically go forward and capture some of the back from some of the things that we've lost. In terms that, well, I'll just stop. Although it's something I guess I'll go on. Anyway, thank you very much. You've been a marvelous audience. Thank you, Arian.